Hi, welcome to theAnalysis-news. In a few seconds, I'll be back with Boris Kagarlitsky, who's coming from Moscow, who's going to give us his take on what's happening inside Russia in regards to the war in Ukraine and the general political situation. Please don't forget, we have a donate button. If you don't donate, we can't do this. If you're on YouTube, hit subscribe, but most importantly, come on over to the website. And if you're listening to the podcast, come to the website and sign up for the email list. And we'll be back in just a few seconds. As much as there is a debate amongst much of the left and progressive world, especially in North America and Europe, but I expect everywhere, there's a very big debate in Russia itself about the war in Ukraine. And now joining us from Moscow to talk about the nature of that debate and his take on things is Boris Kagarlitsky. Boris is a well-known international commentator on Russian politics and society. He was a deputy to the Moscow City Soviet between 1990 and 1993, during which time he was a member of the executive of the Socialist Party of Russia, co-founder of the Party of Labor, and advisor to the chairperson of the Federation of Independent Trade Unions of Russia. Previously, he was a student of art criticism and was imprisoned for 2 years for anti-Soviet activities. Boris's books include Empire of the Periphery, Russia and the World System, Russia under Yeltsin and Putin, Neoliberal Autocracy, and New Realism, New Barbarism, The Crisis of Capitalism. In 2021, Kagarlitsky was sentenced to 10 days in jail for sharing content on social media promoting unpermitted protests by the Communist Party against the results of Russia's recent parliamentary elections. He has the distinction of being put in jail by most governments that have ruled either the Soviet Union or Russia. And he's currently a professor at Moscow Higher School for Social and Economic Sciences in Moscow, and he's editor of the journal Rabcore, which you can find on YouTube as a channel as well. And Matt Taibbi also does some English translations in his Substack, I think it's called Russia Dissent. Thanks very much for joining me, Boris.
Great seeing you, Paul.
So, well, let's just jump into the debate. I remember talking to one of your colleagues who was saying that if Russia only went into Donbas, people would probably be okay with it in Russia. But if he went to Kiev, most of the Russian people would not be okay with that. I don't know if that's true or not. So where is Russian public opinion? And then where is the Russian left movement on this?
Well, I think that position, which was expressed previously, which you mentioned, I think it is and it was shared by quite a few people. And to some extent, it is reasonable, because you see, let us be very clear. There are two things which make this situation very difficult. Because on the one hand, definitely in the current war, and I make it very clear, and most people on the left, at least, people on the left who are independent from the current regime, share this view that Russia is an aggressor in this war. Russia is actually Russian government, Russian military are fighting a war to destroy Ukrainian state. And there is no reason why this war should be justified by any decent person. However, there is a problem here. The problem is that on the other hand, Ukrainian state doesn't generate any sympathy among progressive people. This state was in many ways not only reactionary, but also very repressive. It represses the left. It tries, though with very little success, it tries to repress Russian language, which is spoken by about half of the population of the country. And the policies of Ukrainian state towards Donbas were also extremely repressive and unfair. I think if any of the Ukrainian governments since 2014 tried to do anything to achieve any kind of reconciliation with Donbas people, this current situation didn't take place. Of course, it doesn't mean that Russian government on its side is innocent in terms of Donbas, because you see there are kind of three sides here. The Ukrainian elites and the Ukrainian government on the one hand, the Russian government on the other hand, but there are also people in Donbas, which are kind of caught between these two sides. And initially, the rebellion in Donbas was started very much as a local thing, as a local protest against what was happening in Kiev when there was actually a coup d'etat or whatever. Well, maybe they call it sometimes a revolution of dignity and so on. But it doesn't matter how you call it. The problem was that there was no legitimate government in Kiev. And the people of Donbas were rising against a government which had no legitimacy, which was not elected by them, which was installed after this revolt in Kiev, no matter how you call it, and which didn't care about their interests and their rights. So in that sense, initially, the rebellion in Donbas was quite justified and was a popular rebellion. However, after the attempt of the Ukrainian military to suppress it by force, of course, the Donbas movement had to look for support in Russia. And on the other hand, the Russian side, the Russian government did everything to undermine the popular democratic moment in the Donbas movement. So it's a very different story. What is these Donbas Republic, Donetsk Republic now, or Lugansk Republic now? What are these republics now? Now these republics are being run by, they're being run, sorry. Now these republics are being run by totally corrupt puppets installed by Moscow. And in that sense, I mean, the movement was eroded and it lost its initial meaning. And of course, now we can't say that there is any progressive in Donbas anyhow. But we shouldn't forget that initially, these movements and these republics were produced by a popular rebellion.
Yeah, I remember at the time you were very excited about what was happening when it was beginning.
Exactly. People of Donbas lost that battle. We lost that battle together with them. This is part of the story. And we have to be very clear about that. We lost that battle.
But just for people that don't know the context, you mean the progressives, both in Donbas and in Russia, many of whom actually volunteered to go to try to help build this new progressive Donbas, they lost to the Russian bureau.
Well, that's exactly what I'm saying. That Donbas progressives and Donbas people and Russian progressives and leftists who supported them, they lost that battle in 2014 and 2015. Quite a few people who were central to this movement, to this effort, were actually killed. And they were not killed by Ukrainian troops. They were killed by security forces within Donbass, or people these people were killed. Actually, we have some reasons to think they were killed by the mercenaries sent from Russia. So in that sense, still there is a lot of support for the cause of Donbas inside Russia. So in that sense, it's really true that if Russian troops were only moving to protect Donbas from potential or actual attacks from Ukraine, it would have been supported by quite a few people in Russia. Though in the current circumstances, we have to repeat, it's not the same Donbas movement, not the same Donbas republics as they used to be 8 years ago.
Now, one of the things I've seen as one of the main justifications for the invasion has been that Donbas was under imminent threat of attack. And I've seen numbers that Ukrainian troops were supposed to be massing. The head of the Russian Communist Party claimed, I believe, there was 160,000 Ukrainian troops about to invade Donbas. Foreign Minister Lavrov said there were 120,000 about to invade Donbas. Then I saw the number 60,000 kicking around. But I actually haven't seen any independent source saying there were actually any massing of Ukrainian troops about to invade Donbas. Then the other thing is I've heard from Lavrov and others that there was a genocide going on against Donbas. But the UN and the OSCE observers say that from 2018 to 2021, 310 people were killed by Ukrainian troops. And in 2021 itself, it was, I believe the number was 36. You know, I mean, the more people were probably killed in car accidents. So am I getting a correct take? There really was no imminent threat of a massive Ukrainian assault on Donbas?
Of course, there was not. Because first of all, let's be clear. Yes, Ukrainian troops did shell Donetsk region, and the Donetsk militia also shelled Ukrainian troops. So there were troops on both sides. There were government forces and there were militias. They were actually shelling each other. Not every day. It was not very active. But that was kind of business as usual. I hate to say it was a business as usual for maybe 6 years since the actual hostilities stopped. I mean, there were some activities not only in 2014, but later. But for the last years, I mean, people traveled back and forth. And yes, sometimes there were clashes on the front line, but basically it was not a real war. Sometimes it's more like, like between India and Pakistan, between India and Pakistan, they have this, the line of temporary border with troops on both sides. And sometimes they start shelling each other, and it goes on for decades, as you know, right? And it goes on for decades. And sometimes somebody gets killed on one side or another, and it doesn't mean it is a real war, and it doesn't mean one side is going to invade another side, And of course, both sides kept troops along the frontier because both sides accused the other side of starting or planning to start an invasion or some hostilities and so on. So, and really, yes, that continues for years. And I mean, people, like at least kind of normal people within Donbas, they sort of saw that as a very unpleasant but kind of normal condition. So that's one thing. And the second thing, speaking about Ukrainian troops being massed around Donbas, one of the reasons why fighting is going on so heavily around the very same places, which were around the front line of the previous stage of conflict, is that Ukrainian troops had defensive positions there. So now we see that Russian troops are storming Severodonetsk for already 2 months without much of a success. They stormed Popasne for about a month. Finally, they managed to take it over, but after a month of heavy fighting. Why so? One of the reasons was that there were really very strong defensive positions, which were established by Ukrainian troops exactly to fight back Russian invasion. So, which means that yes, Ukraine did have troops there, and probably in January, February, they did some massing of the troops in this area for the obvious reason. Russia massed much more of its own troops on its side. So that means that, imagine if you're massing your troops, and then the other side, which knows that you are bringing more and more reinforcements, more and more troops and cannons and tanks and so on to the area, then the other side begins also bringing in some reinforcements. And then you say, look, they're massing their troops, they're going to attack us. You see, that was exactly the case of Russian government propaganda, because already in spring 2021, there were huge numbers of troops which were sent to Ukrainian border, and they were kept there for a few months, then sent back. No war happened. And by the way, that led many people to the conclusion that this time it would be very much the same thing. The war wouldn't happen because, well, okay, last time it didn't work out so badly. But I have a lot of contacts in Siberia, in Irkutsk, because I was quite active helping local communists there to win the elections in September, which they actually did against the fraud, by the way. In Siberia, in Yakutia, in Magadan, there was one single campaign in these three areas. That's how Russian electoral system is organized. That you have these huge mega constituencies, kind of, and there the Communist Party won. And one of the reasons why it won against the attempts of fraud was that they had more radical people in the Communist Party there who were actually running the campaign, and they won, unlike many other places.
Now, let me for people watching who don't know, the Communist Party in Russia is a complex thing because the leader of the main Communist Party couldn't be more pro-war. He's almost more pro-war than Putin is.
I will speak about that later. I'll tell you more about that. Just coming back to the story. So about 2 months before the actual war, people from Irkutsk started sending me messages and photos and videos of enormous numbers of tanks and cannons and armed personnel carriers and all sorts of military equipment being moved along the Trans-Siberian Railway to the west. It's not something you do when you're very peaceful. Let's put it this way.
This was when? This is in September, you say?
No. First time it was in March, April, and second time it was in January, February. So they kept massing forces for months, and they were massing so much force there that they had to bring troops and military equipment from the Far East, from the Chinese border, So it means they were bringing in everything they had. So again, it's not something you do when you're just going to to protect your friends. You're not massing such enormous quantities of troops. So it's very clear that they were preparing for a full-scale war, and that's exactly what happened. And again, coming back to this Donbas issue, yes, if they were just saying and doing something around Donbas, saying, okay, we're going to move some troops into Donbas republics proper and keep these troops there just to protect these republics against being attacked. Okay, I'm not going to be, I wouldn't be very happy about it, but I'm not going to say it would be such a bad thing to do, because, as I told you before, I'm not very happy with the Ukrainian government either. But it was not about Donbas. Actually, the interesting thing is that the real fighting in Donbas, the massive fighting, started only about late March, when it became clear that Russian troops failed to take over Kiev. Ukrainian capital. So the major forces were not sent to Donbas, and there was no Ukrainian offensive on Donbas, of course. The troops were sent to take over Kiev, and it seems that the plan originally was to somehow overthrow the current Ukrainian government and install a puppet government in Kiev instead of the elected one. And then we don't know what would have been happening later, because it seems there was very little planning about it. Because another thing which is very rarely discussed in the West, even in Ukraine itself, is that there was a tremendous political crisis in Russia for months. So the election in September for the government party, United Russia, was a total failure. People didn't show up to vote for them. If they showed up, they voted for the opposition. So that led them to the need to have massive electoral fraud. So there, for example, if we look at Moscow, in Moscow, opposition deputies won 14 constituencies out of, I think, 20. 14 out of 20. See, that was the result. 14 out of 20. And then they have rewritten the results. They have rewritten the results. So by 10 o'clock, the opposition was winning. Next morning, they declared that no, every single constituency was won by the government party. The same thing happened almost everywhere. In the Far East and in Siberia, things were a little different, a little better. And it was partly also because of a lot of popular mobilization, which made local bureaucracy think that it would be better not to do the worst, not to rewrite the results. They tried to correct the results a little bit, but they didn't go as far as in Moscow or elsewhere. So in fact, the government actually lost the elections, and they knew that perfectly well, and that led them to the conclusion that something had to be done about it. Also, we know that Putin's health is not very good, and the economic crisis, the social crisis is really serious, very deep in this country. And as a result, there was this feeling at the top, around the Kremlin, I should say, in the administration, that something has to be done to reverse the trend. And the best way, and it's very traditional, the best way to reverse the trend is to have a little victorious war. They remember that in 2014, as you probably know, Russia annexed Crimea. And that was popular with the people. That was popular with the people that created the so-called Crimean consensus, which actually increased Putin's popularity and political stability within the country, even though economic situation continued to deteriorate. And now what they were trying to do, they were trying to remake this story, to do the remake of the Crimean success. This time they needed a small war with Ukraine, which should have been a success, a very rapid success and a very easy success. And then you do what? You organize a parade, you organize rallies, concerts, celebrations about victory. They wanted to finish it within 96 hours. It was actually reported. And if worst comes to worst, they wanted to do the May Day celebrations, May 9th, when we celebrate the end of the victory of in the Second World War. They wanted to have this May Day celebrations as a celebration of victory in yet another war. and kind of bring back this image of Putin as a victor, as a savior, as somebody who is always bringing in success and achievement. And that failed. That failed because they underestimated the Ukrainian troops. They overestimated their own potential force. They thought that Ukrainian people would have been greeting Russian troops with flowers. It didn't happen. And by the way, it could have happened in 2014. Again, as I told you, when Ukraine didn't have any legitimate government. Now, like it or not, Ukraine has a legitimate government. And Ukrainians had no reason to accept somebody, some puppet imposed on them from the Kremlin to have this new regime to accept it as something better as compared to what they had.
So, Boris, the other big argument, other than Donbas, obviously, was this expansion of NATO. And in the West, there's sections of the left, and in the global South, it's almost perhaps predominant opinion that this was done because of the provocation and expansion of NATO, even though I think it was rather obvious that Ukraine wasn't going to get into NATO anyway. But the militarization of Ukraine, they called that de facto NATOization. I mean, was that a real factor? Because you're talking mostly about domestic political considerations here.
I am talking about these domestic considerations exactly because they were the only ones which really mattered. You know, that's the problem. Everything you're saying that is just stupid excuses used by propaganda, by the Russian propaganda, by the government propaganda. You see, that's the problem. Well, you know, when they often say, what have you done for 8 years? And then we repeat that, okay, great, guys, tell us, what have you done for 8 years? Nothing, nothing. They did nothing when NATO expanded. It did expand. It did expand. When Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania joined NATO, that was okay. By the way, Estonia is much closer to major Russian cities than any place in Ukraine. Estonia I think it's Estonian frontier is like maybe 2 hours ride, maybe less than 2 hours ride on a car from St. Petersburg. Wait a minute, and nobody cared. If they were really taking that seriously, they would have done diplomatically at least something to stop it happening, or at least something to kind of influence Estonian politicians in order to make them kind of more eager to negotiate with Russians. But again, it was very interesting that there are lots of problems in Estonia. By the way, among other things, they have absolutely shameful practices of discriminating local Russian population. And Russian government sometimes, when they need, they made noises. They make noises sometimes when they need about that, but they never tried any serious diplomatic effort to support local Russian communities.
I have to add to that. They did, as far as I know, nothing on the UN or international stage to complain about this horrible genocide against Donbas. They never said much of a word about it until they were ready to invade.
But that's exactly the point. They didn't care. They didn't care at all. No, I'll just give you one example about Estonia, because I know Estonia pretty well. I spent years and years. I spent many for years and years as a child. I spent my vacations there, so I know every place there. I know people there, and so on. And there is a problem with Russian books in libraries. So I went to one of these Russian foundations, which are established to promote so-called Ruski Mir, Russian world, or whatever, Russian culture, and said, why don't we organize a project to send Russian books? I mean, especially books translated into Russian from English, French, German, and so on, to Estonian libraries, which would have been a great thing both for Russians and Estonians, because you don't have these books in Estonian either. So if you get these books in Russian, so both Russians and Estonians would read them in Russian, like it happened in the Soviet times. So I spent a few months trying to convince them to do something like that, to do some to do this project. There are other people who are trying to get other similar projects done to support Russian culture and Russian communities in these republics, and it was totally rejected. They were totally uninterested. They were totally uninterested. They were totally uninterested in Russians there. You know, they were only interested when there was a big project where you could steal a lot of money. You see, and doing anything practical is not good, because the more practical the more reasonable your project is, the less it's fit for big theft. You know. And unless there is a perspective of a huge theft, nobody cares about anything in this country. You know, and this you have to understand.
Okay, let me ask you a question. So Putin does this primarily for domestic political considerations. It's, you know, I was in another interview, I was mentioning how President Bush, before the 9/11 attacks, was the subject of ridicule. And then there was even a TV show called That's My Bush, ridiculing the Bush family on the Comedy Channel. And of course, right after 9/11, he's a hero. And then the invasion of Iraq, he's a wartime president. His popularity goes again. So this is not just a Russian phenomena, this use of war. But that being said, how could they be so wrong? This is the opposite of what they've achieved in terms of shoring up his domestic strength. He has to look incompetent and weak. In terms of NATO, he's strengthened NATO, and he's given the Western arms manufacturers a present they couldn't even dream of. What is this going to mean in terms of the domestic politics?
Well, it was a failure, but again, this is another problem of Russian politics. Actually, in reality, Russian government and Russian Putin's team, they fail every time they do anything. But there is one problem. No matter what they do, they have this propaganda machine which can turn any failure into a tremendous victory. But there is one problem, that you can't do that with a war. And this was a big mistake, because, well, you know, you can have like when there were economic failures, you know, they have this whole new language, like, you know, when the economy is declining or collapsing, you know how they call it? Negative growth.
I think they use that here too.
Our economy is always growing, just sometimes negatively, but the growth continues, and so on and so on.
Well, they have more than 100 years of learning how to say that bullshit.
Yes, yeah, it's very Orwellian. We have this whole new language, and you know, well, I just cannot even remember all the funny terms they invented. Like, for example, when there is an explosion, for example, they say something is clapping, and so on. You know, that's the kind of language.
Yeah.
And
well, but people must know by now how badly the war is going. There was that one Russian, I think he was a colonel, a fairly senior officer, was actually on Russia Channel 1. And he said that the war is a mess. He said it wasn't planned properly. It's a disaster. So the word is getting out now.
Well, let me finish with the leadership, and then we'll come to the war. So the thing with the leadership is that, we have this oligarchy which is totally corrupt and totally uninterested in anything except money. And that makes them incompetent in everything that is not about getting money into their pockets. They're extremely competent in achieving that particular thing, extremely competent, but everything else is something they don't care, or they think that it's achieved through propaganda and so on. And again, yes, they miscalculated, but they partly miscalculated because so far they were able to present any failure as a success. As I told you, they were very much spoiled by their previous experience. But then, yes, things went completely wrong. They were kind of forced to go into a war which they cannot win. And to make things worse, nobody knows what does it mean to win this war, because where's the goal? Where's the end game? What's going to be considered to be the victory or success? No goals were formulated. No goals were made clear to anyone except maybe for Putin, who had the initial goal of presenting himself as a strong leader.
Well, if the oligarchy is only interested in making money, then this total miscalculation by Putin has to be bad for business. I mean, maybe for the military industrial complex, it's not so bad, but for everybody else, it can't be very good.
Well, it's also bad for military industrial complex because they don't get the spare parts from the West, because they're very much dependent on their Western partners, who are not so much competitors but partners also. No, they all know it's very bad for business. They just don't have the way out. There is no plan B, and there is no strategy to get out of this mess. And that's why the way they operate is that, okay, we don't know how to get out of this mess, so we have to continue till the moment when we find the way or create some opportunities to get out of this mess.
Well, what way out is there other than to somehow get rid of Putin? He's so identified with this. I mean, if the West, I think, because of the danger of nuclear war, by accident more than by design, but still it gets more and more dangerous in these circumstances. I mean, if the West, to me, had any brains, they would give Putin a way out, but they would seem not to want to. What choice does that leave the oligarchs? But the question is, do the oligarchs outside of Putin and those people around him have any power?
There are two problems here. One problem is that, yes, they would like to get rid of him, but again, it's not so easy. And technically, it's not so easy. And second, they're afraid that if they get rid of Putin, they actually could be next. Because, as I told you, the country it's not boiling, of course, but it's very hot already. People hate them. People hate the oligarchs. People hate the top bureaucrats. People hate them all, And in a certain sense, even though Putin is becoming very unpopular with the oligarchs now, he's still the one who is actually the best choice for them. That's the irony. With Putin, it's very bad. Without Putin, it's very dangerous. And that creates this kind of paralysis. And then also you have to understand that Putin is a person who definitely is very ill, and nobody knows how long he's going to survive. But by the way, he can survive for quite a lot of time, and maybe he can die tomorrow. Nobody knows.
Now, do we know what he is ill from? Because that isn't being talked about much that I've seen in the West, anyway.
Well,
there's a little bit that somebody saw his hand shaking or something, but there hasn't been that much focus on it.
There are plenty of discussions online in Russia if you surf Russian social networks. What you get is you get doctors commenting, you get people sharing some rumors. Whether these rumors are correct or right or wrong, we don't know. It's another problem when you don't have adequate information. We have to analyze rumors. I had already written a whole text about political science being forced to use rumors as only source of reliable information, because the rest of the information is even less reliable than rumors. That's the kind of situation we're in, and but it doesn't mean that we know anything. It means that there are reasons to think that this person is ill and that he is not going to survive for too long, but nobody knows for sure, and that adds to the situation of uncertainty. By the way, for example, I just can give you one example. There is one business Telegram channel which actually reports basically the exchange rates and the current situation with stocks and so on and so on. And these days, every single daily report ends with one phrase, with one sentence: Russia is still expecting the main news. You know what everybody knows what is the main news, because that was the same joke with Brezhnev when Brezhnev was very ill, and there were plenty of jokes about uh, Russians picking up newspapers every day, expecting to get the news.
So now that more and more Russian boys, workers, are coming home in body bags, and more families are being directly affected in Russia by this war, not just in terms of their sons dying, but also wounded, and also deprivation in terms of goods. Is the anti-war sentiment growing?
Not so much, by the way. Let's be again. Let's be more analytical. The way the army is formed is very specific. They tried not to send draftees there into Ukraine, and they really tried to avoid that. And this is very important because they know, as Americans knew, elites learned the lesson of Vietnam, and Russian elites learned the lesson of Afghanistan. When you have an army based on draft, the army is very much connected to the society. So the society cares about the war, and the society cares about casualties and so on. Then, when it was very much the American idea to shift from an army based on draft to an army based on contracting people, which is what you call the poverty draft, right? And it's very much the same thing in Russia. Not only this, uh, it's even more specific. That, for example, we studied the news about people who were killed. Of course, we have very little news because most of the news is not coming even to the social media. But you can study social media in the if you spend a lot of time, you can find the reports and so on.
This is like in the war in Iraq. They wouldn't let the network television show coffins coming back from the Iraq war on American TV.
Exactly. There are tremendous similarities. It's very similar. And by the way, Russian elites learn from American elites a lot. They really follow, they really learn. They learn from each other, really. And what they do in Russia, it's even more specific because, as I told you, we're trying to follow the reports on social networks, like somebody's son or brother and so on was killed. That was somehow reported by people in chats and so on. So of course you get not the full picture, but at least some pieces. That what you discovered is astonishing, because they have taken mostly boys from rural areas, depressed rural areas, which are the most remote rural areas. Like, yes, they get a lot of guys from Siberia, for example. But these people are not from Irkutsk, not from Krasnoyarsk, not from Novosibirsk, not from any of these major towns, major cities, not even from district towns. They're from remote villages and from some smallest towns, which are kind of 200, 300, 1,000 kilometers away from Irkutsk, you see? So even if you take a place like Irkutsk or Krasnoyarsk or Novosibirsk or Tomsk, which are Siberian cities, then you discover people know nothing about the war because people who got killed are away. They're not only kilometers away, they're hundreds of kilometers away, you know? And the actual urban society doesn't feel any pressure, doesn't feel any concern about what's happening. And also, you know, it's not only these people who got killed in these villages. Their families are 1,000 kilometers away from any major city. These villages are maybe hundreds of kilometers between themselves. You know, so the total discommunication. So the actual numbers of people killed are quite impressive. It seems that it's about 40,000 people killed already, quite a lot of people, more than in Afghanistan, for example, much more than in Afghanistan. However, these numbers are dispersed and around huge space. So don't forget about Russia in terms of space. It's a huge country in terms of space. It's not only big. So there's a lot of space. Just give an example that a lot of people are killed in Buryatia. First, Buryats are very poor. It's a very poor minority. It's a very important minority, ethnic minority in Siberia, but they're very poor. Most of the people, of course, there are rich people everywhere, but they're very poor. And then if you go to Ulan-Ude, which is the capital of Buryatia, you can hardly find any evidence that so many people are killed in this area because most people are from some very remote villages, so they don't even get into Ulan-Ude unless just some report about them consciously collected to inform society, which some people are doing. Some people are doing it, and they're trying to make people worried. But then you have another problem that once people are not getting that as part of their only, when people don't get that as part of their real experience, they see that as something very distant. And you know what we get is that the support for the war is very weak. At the same time, anti-war movement and anti-war sentiment are also very weak. You know? That's the problem. So most of the society so far is indifferent. And that is very dangerous. Of course, this is very, very, well, very, I should say, traumatic for those people who are against the war. But that's how things really are. I don't want to make anybody have any illusions about that. Most people are indifferent. But the general trend is that there are more and more people getting worried and less people being happy, because even among those people who are happy with the war in principle, there are lots and lots of reasons to think that something goes wrong with the war. So there is yet another type of opposition. There are people who are against the war, and there are people who approve war, but who are not happy with the way the war is conducted. And this is another kind of opposition which is also emerging. And sometimes these people are more angry against the government than us.
Well, I was thinking that, you know, if Putin fell, there's no guarantee that whoever becomes the next leader isn't actually more aggressive than Putin.
Well, I think the next leader, no matter who he is going to be, maybe she is going to be, because there are rumors that Putin wants his daughter to be the next leader. But anyhow, the next leader would face the consequences of a disaster, and we'll see that as a major turmoil. Because finishing this interview, because I really have to sum up, There is a good Russian tradition that we start reforms and revolutions every time we lose a war. We have this tradition. Russia lost Crimean War, then they had to abolish serfdom, they have to do some progressive reforms and so on. And finally, that generates a lot of social movements. Finally, as you know, Alexander II, the Tsar, was killed by revolutionaries. Then Nicholas II lost Russo-Japanese War. Russo-Japanese War was lost by Nicholas II, and after that, First Russian Revolution happened. Then First World War was also lost. Then February and October Revolution happened. And after Afghanistan, Soviet Union collapsed. So we have a good tradition. That's one of the reasons why these people are very much afraid of losing the war or accepting the fact that they lost the war. But in one way or another, they already lost it.
All right. Well, I know you have to run, Boris, so thanks very much. We're going to rebook Boris as soon as we can. I'm hoping even next week. And this is clearly, there's about a 2 or 3 or 4 part interview here. So we'll arrange that as soon as we can. So thanks, Boris, and thank you for joining us on theAnalysis.news. Don't forget, there's a donate button, and subscribe and get on the email list. Share. The most important, share with your friends and colleagues. Thanks again.